guys, and welcome to Mastering Hard Surface, Lesson 5. Firstly, I just want to apologize for my voice being a little bit croaky. I started to lose it before recording the lesson, so there's not much I can do about that. I've just kind of got to get along with it. So basically, in this lesson, we'll be continuing on from Lesson 4, and this will be the last lesson where we focus on the blueprints from this particular Ferrari model. Because we're so early in the course, I wanted you all to see exactly what the workflow I use involves in a production situation, so you know what to expect later in the course when we start tackling some more of those complex projects that have more detailed designs. I'm going to focus on detailing some more complicated areas of the car in this lesson, just to wrap up our work on the project. And then in the next lesson, I'll be taking a step back so we can reevaluate what has been learned so far and apply it to some more clear-cut examples. Now lastly, before I get started, I'm going to show you how to set up the blueprints from a JPEG format, as even though I prefer to use splines, you won't always have them available. So the setup is pretty similar and it's really easy and fast to do. So we'll get started with that. So after finishing the last lesson, I had a couple of guys ask me how to set up blueprints based on a JPEG format or any kind of image. Because I only showed you how to set up splines, there was a couple of guys who wanted me to just quickly clear up how that was done. So the way I'm about to show you is kind of one of many ways in which you can do it, but the reason I'm showing you this particular way is because I feel personally that it's the fastest and easiest way to set up blueprints. Because most often you're going to get them in one plain sheet like this. So all I'm going to do is, and before I do that, I just want to point out that I've made the background of this image a kind of light gray so that we don't get confused when we're modeling based on this image with a pure white background. Sometimes when you have objects selected, you'll notice the wireframe goes white, and when you've got a perfectly white background image in your blueprint, you can get very confusing because you can't physically tell the difference between the wireframe and your background. So I've just darkened that off a little bit, and now when we model over the top, we should be able to see the car a little bit more easily. So I'm just going to go ahead and save the image as a JPEG. And then inside of Max, I'm just going to drag out a plane. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a standard material, go to the diffuse slot. Let me just clear that out for you as I've already set this up. Click the diffuse slot and load a bitmap. Now when I load that, I'll just go back. It's important to note that as you're loading it, to remember the image dimensions. So you can see down the bottom here, we've got it as 4000 by 2159. So when I apply this to the background plane, this is currently out of proportion. And to get that in proportion, I'm just going to change the dimensions. So I'm going to make the width 4000 and the vertical height 2159. Now you'll see that the image is totally out of scale compared to the scene, so we need to get that matched. So what we need to do is we need to go into the blueprint file, and we'll see here on the left that the size of the car is 4.72 meters. So what I can do next is I can create a box, and I'm going to make it 470.2 centimeters wide. Now we've got a correct scale for our car, so that when we go to scale this image, we've got a correct reference for that. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the hierarchy tab of the plane that we're using for the blueprints, hit Effect Pivot, and then just very roughly move the pivot to the center of the side blueprint. Now when I move this over the image plane and scale it, it's a little bit easier to manage the overall scale. If you can't see through the blueprint and you don't have it behind, you can just hit Alt X and then you'll see both. So let me just hide the car model we had set up previously, and I'm just going to scale these blueprints until they line up horizontally. Can take just a little bit of work, and I don't ever do things absolutely pinpoint perfect because the blueprints themselves aren't perfect anyway. So now we've got the blueprint scaled correctly, and when we model, it's going to be the correct scale compared to the real life car. So at this point, we've got a plane, but we haven't broken it up into the individual blueprints so that we can rotate them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to convert it to an editable poly, swap to vertice mode, enable the cut tool, and I'm just going to quickly cut around each different side of the car. It doesn't have to be perfectly clean. And when you're done, you should have 4 different polygons making up each image. So the next thing I'm going to do is one by one, I'm going to select each polygon and hit detach, and then move on to the next polygon and detach that also. Now, as you do that, you'll notice I'm not deselecting the object, because when you do detach a polygon, it keeps your main object selection handy and detaches the polygon you'd selected to a different object. So after you've detached 3 pieces, you should be left with 4 different polygons. And they all should have the same pivot point. So to fix that, I'm just going to select all 4 of them using Control, go to the Hierarchy tab again, hit Effect Pivot, and Center to Object. Now we've got a rough kind of center line for each of those blueprints. And at this point, we know we've got the car aligned to 0, because usually the box will be. So you can see we're at 0 and 0 here. Doesn't matter about the height because we've already scaled the image plane correctly. So now if I go to the perspective viewport and just make this shaded just so it's a bit smoother, I can rotate this image plane 90 degrees. And if all I do is rotate this move this background plane backwards, we know that those are aligned. Now from above, all I need to do is get this aligned to the center. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to enable the grid again. I'm going to hide everything. And now when I go in, I'm just going to make the center of the car on the top blueprint aligned to our origin, so that when we model, it's correctly aligned. Just delete this. If you've ever you'll notice here in the viewport, just a handy little tip, we've got a whole bunch of objects with different wireframe colors. What you can do to sometimes speed up that selection process, rather than going in and manually selecting each one, you can select it, right click, and go select similar, and it should select based on wireframe color, and it'll speed that up for you. So I'm just going to select the blueprints we've got now and the car and just hide unselected. Now we've got the top blueprint set up, we've got the left blueprint set up, and now we just need to do the front and side. So for the front, I can rotate this 90 degrees. The back, I can rotate it 90 degrees also. And now I can just move those into position the exact same way we set up the wireframe blueprints using the splines. If I go from the front view and just hide unselected, I should be able to line things up pretty closely. And the same goes for the back. I'm just going to select the back blueprint, move to the back view, or the right view, sorry, and I'm just going to line that up to the center. So at this point, we've basically got the blueprint set up, but you'll see by default in 3ds Max, and I find this extremely stupid, the default resolution for displaying textures is 512 pixels, and it's just not enough, as you can see here. So to fix that, what we can do is we can right click the plus checkbox here, go to configure viewports. If we go to display performance, we can change the texture map resolution here. You can set that between 2048 and 4096 depending on the quality you need, but when you do that, you will need to restart Max. So I'm just going to do that now, and when I reload it, you'll see that the image quality has improved greatly. So instantly our blueprints are much more recognizable now, and they're a little bit easier to do that final alignment and make sure that they're sitting on 0. So feel free to fine tune that as much as you want, but what you'll end up with is a very similar setup to the wireframes, and it's at this point where you can kind of see the benefit of using the wireframe, because when you're using an image from different angles, you can't see through the car to kind of gauge what areas represent what parts of the car, and they're just much more blocky and annoying. So that's why I like working with the wireframes, and that's why when you have access to them, I'd seriously recommend just using those instead of images. So now we can get started on some of the modeling in this lesson. And one of the first things I want to show you is, because it's going to kind of be a theme throughout this lesson, is how to round off and sharpen corners. So if I go into Photoshop, what I'm going to do is once again, I've got my reference images loaded up here. And you can see on different parts of the car where our wireframe starts to flow. We run into points like edge lines and little indented parts of the car that'll need to be cleaned up. So I'm going to make a new layer here, make it a green color. And how I usually do this is as usual, when this flows, I'm going to try and keep that topology flowing, and I'm going to flow it across this way. So on these corner points, you end up with a very simple 4-sided polygon. I don't like to go in and select these edges and then start beveling them at the end, because it's a very messy and unclean way of working. So I always like to just use one edge line across and another going down, and you end up with that nice clean point. So now we can go into Max and kind of just start doing that. Let me just move my blueprints, sorry, my reference images to the left here. So for example, we've got a cut line running down the car here. And what I'm going to do is because this particular point is running very close to that line, and I don't really know how to clean up that area yet, I'm going to select that point and just remove it. So now when I go to cut, I'm going to select this point here and connect down. And usually I'd probably wait until I had the full car modeled and do a quick slice. So if I go back, you can see here, if I use the quick slice tool, I can select at any point along that edge and then kind of just drag out. And what this does is it's creating those points for me along the entire edge of the car. One of the small issues with doing that is you might not always get it perfectly accurate. So say for example, I come up here and I finish aligning it here. It's not exactly on line. Now I'm not crazy enough to care about things like that, but for the perfectionists, it can be a big deal. So usually, to make things absolutely perfect, if you do things at a smaller scale when you're zoomed in, you can get those cuts lined up a lot more closely. Even though it's a little bit more work. So now I've got this line cut, and I'm just going to shape for that to create the gap. And I'm just going to make that small. Remember, it's probably always better if you're not exactly sure how small these gaps are to go smaller, because it's always easier to expand those later, whereas closing them up is much more challenging. To show you what I mean there, if I make this too wide, and you can see we've just got a little bit of an issue here. To fix that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move and weld this point, and I'm going to weld this point, and I'm going to move this line going up and this line going down, and I'm just going to get rid of these 2 points just so that when I'm demonstrating how to clean up this area, you'll see what I mean. So let me chamfer this, and now we've got a correct, nice clean chamfer. If I go too big here, when I delete these polygons, if I've already gone in and started shifting these edges in, when we start to smooth, one of the only ways I can close that gap is to either select the edges and move them in, which I wouldn't recommend, because then you'll see that the points don't line up anymore, or I can go in and delete it all and kind of connect them again. So if you're new to modeling cars and you don't know exactly how wide it is, I recommend starting off small, because what you can do later is you can always select that edge. Now you'll see now if I delete these points inside here, I can select this edge and hit chamfer, and what this is going to do is it's going to create an edge offset from the border, and then I can use that to go in and make a selection and delete these polygons, and now I've got a new larger gap in between. From this point, I'm going to select my outside border edges now, and I'm just going to drag these in to create that new hard edge that we can witness here on this side of the car. So now we've dragged out this edge loop, and in order to create the hardness here, what I'll do next is I'll select these, and you can either hit extrude if you want and go in, and you can set it to be 0 on the width, and then all you need to do is go in, and what that does is it creates a nice even distribution of the polygons going inwards. So when I smooth that result, we haven't added the support loops yet, but we do have a nice clean edge loop running on the inside. So as I was saying, what I don't like to do is I don't like selecting these points and using the chamfer tool. I'll always go in and use support loops. So in order to do that, sometimes you need to get your hands messy and things aren't so clean. So what you can do is you can select all the edges adjacent to that edge loop and just hit connect. And if you use one segment, you'll see it's very messy. But if I go in now with edge constraint toggle, I can slide that from a kind of cleaner viewpoint all the way to the edge and then slide it back like I've done in previous lessons. And now we've started to add hardness to that inside point. So the same goes for here. I can select all these edges, connect it once, drag it in, drag it back, and there we are. The same goes for here. I don't like to select this edge point and add a chamfer to it. I'll always add two support edge loops to create hardness here. Now one issue that can happen is when you've got two separate polygon islands and you use the connect tool, if you use slide, it can go to the opposite side. It's quite annoying, and to get around that, what you can do is you can zero off both of these, set two segments, and now when you go on the pinch, you can get this bottom edge loop correctly aligned, and then very simply select these 2 points and control remove them. And now we've got a nice hard edge here, and everything's flowing cleanly. If the edge needs to be harder, you can go in and do the exact same thing down the bottom here, and then remove these 2 points once again. So now that is as clean as that edge can possibly be for cars, and whenever you have those corner points, they should all look like that. So you've got a support loop on each side running horizontally and vertically. Because I haven't set things up incorrectly or been lazy about how I created those support loops, it's very easy to undo some of that work And you will find occasionally that you kind of preemptively add cuts and other lines like that you just didn't have enough geometry to work with when doing it, and it makes things much harder to deal with. So my point is that at this stage of the car model, you probably wouldn't want to go in and add these details because there's still quite a few areas running up the top of the car that need to be smoothed and ironed out. And when you go in and add all this extra information and these extra points, I can't just easily go in now and start cutting through the surface to create the correct shapes that are more clearly visible in the concept images. So you can just simply select one by one all the different edge loop points. And now if I go Control E to select the loops of those and remove them, it's very easy to undo all that work. I can select the inside points and these border edges that we created, and I can delete those. And with a few simple clicks, we're back to where we started. So I want to kind of move on to a little bit more of a complex area of the car now, and that's this rear backside where we've got this indent cut in. And I'll just load that up to show you. And it's this kind of cut here. So using what I was just talking about, we're going to create this kind of indented edge and then continue to drag out this point to the back of the car. So with all these points selected, I can undo this selection, and from side on, actually I'll probably remove this one also. I'm just going to drag them out. And now before extruding any further, I'm just going to quickly move these points, and we're going to clean that up in a second, but just so that it's not stretching out, so when we go to move down, it's a little bit more clean. So we've dragged out this edge loop, and now you can see here it is, but we're quite messy on the sides. So I'm going to go in, and where the wheel arch is, I'm just going to cut those polygons. And just roughly, because we are going to clean this up, I'm just cutting those in. Now I can select these inside polygon points and delete them. And now our geometry is a little bit more closely aligned. I also need to go in, and you can see this secondary edge here is what's creating that flat edge on the car rim area. So if I cut up here, the goal is to just create those support loops, and you'll see it's quite messy at the moment, but as usual, I just lay down the edge loops first and then go in and clean them. Get rid of this point. I'm going to add another edge loop running along this point here so that we've got enough geometry. You can see right now we just don't have enough. So I'm just going to connect that in and quickly reset those. Now we need to go back and adjust the previous points. See, there's always just a little bit of cleanup, and I'm always just trying to keep these points flowing. In a nice even manner. You can see now we've got a kind of point coming in here, and to fix that, I'm just going to keep that edge loop flowing and move it along here. see we've got a little bit of an error here, and I'm always swapping between show and result to see things like this because it's much more obvious to see that bend on the smoothed wireframe than it is on the unsmoothed. And you'll see now that because I've shown you this workflow a little bit more while I'm working, it starts to become a little bit quicker. Now, in order to keep things as clean as possible, realistically, all these edges from here to here need to flow evenly along. And we can see we don't have that at the moment. We've got this triangular point, and in order to keep things as smooth as they can possibly be, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a point along here. And even though there's probably a little bit too many of these now, what we do have is a more flowing distribution of edge loops. So I'm always working towards that goal of keeping things running in the correct direction and not kind of crisscrossing the wireframes. So what this is going to mean is it's going to mean I'm going to need to manually adjust each of these points, and we might have too many of them, but it's always better to move points that are lined up correctly than moving less points that are all over the shop in terms of the edge flow. So now, because this loop here is running along here and our topology doesn't follow that, I'm going to quickly move these points up into alignment with this back edge. And now we can cut along and create this separate piece. And I'm just going to delete all this excess geometry. Now I'm going to go in and redistribute that wireframe so that we keep that edge flow happening. So when I cut along here, now if I target back to that point, this loop is flowing correctly. Now to do the same here, I'm going to connect to this point and delete that. Now we've got another row of polygons flowing nicely. And the last one here, I'm just going to weld this point, and now you'll see that we've got a nice, perfectly flowing line of topology, and later on we can go in and harden this off, just like I was talking about by adding those support loops in. So I'll quickly run you through that here. I'm just going to add the loop there. We create a little triangle, but it doesn't really matter at the moment. I'm going to create a support loop for that here. Even though I missed it, it doesn't actually matter, because when I target weld these up and delete this inside point, it's nice and hard and the topology is still flowing as good as it can for this point. So I'm going to take a sec at this point to figure out just how much this area of the car curves in, and you can see it's kind of going to follow what we've got going on here. Because it's too early days, I'm just going to connect these points back up now. And you'll see now that I'm working a little bit faster, my explanations for what I'm doing start to appear like I'm kind of creating them a little bit more in real time, as opposed to pre-planning out how I'd model the car. Not everything you do is always going to work in that perfectly smooth fashion, but if you stick to some basic laws, your topology will continue to flow nicely and you will have relatively smooth geometry during this phase. You can see I've got a little bit of a messy area here because of that point, and to fix that I'm just going to go in and connect these points down, and I'm going to connect this point here and get rid of this, and then keep this flowing up. So once again, we've got some horizontal lines, but this point here isn't exactly flowing around the car nicely. So that's probably going to be one area that I need to focus on later once I've got a little bit more detail on the car. Probably remove this for now, just to make things a little bit more simple. And I'm going to target this up, target weld this up here, and remove this edge also, because we just went a little bit too far at that point. Now sometimes, just randomly, I'll see things that don't really look like they're flowing nicely to me, and I'll just jump onto those. Sorry, I'm losing my voice a little bit here. I'm going to pull this point down. You can always just see little areas to clean up, but right now this point isn't exactly doing what we want. So to clean this point up, I'm just going to cut an edge loop along here and target weld. I'm going to create a point here, and now I can target weld that, and now I've cleaned up this polygon so that once again these lines are flowing. When I select, it loops. When I select, it loops. Or it rings, sorry. So I'm just going to go in and add an edge loop in between here so we've got a clean flowing connection happening. And at this point, I'm not really sure how I'd want to tackle this area because it is quite complex. Sometimes I'd like to fill the whole area in and weld it kind of like this, and then go in and start cutting in the detail into this area. But I think in this particular instance, to make things a little bit easier for ourselves, I'm going to go from the top view, and I'm going to make sure that our edge loops are flowing inside that exhaust vent. I'm just trying to keep these things aligned and clean and easy to understand. So sometimes I'll select a group of polygons and just kind of weld them a little bit more flat. Kind of like what I'm about to do here. So one of the big issues with this car is, and a few of you guys pointed it out, is that the blueprints aren't that high quality. So it wasn't exactly the whole point of the lesson. I knew they weren't going to line up exactly, but it's more just to break down this workflow for you. And obviously, if you are using blueprints that are a little bit more detailed, it's going to make your life easier because you don't need to go in and constantly reevaluate all the points on the surface. So you'll see now that even though the mesh is really quite messy and smoothing terribly, because the topology is working in our favor as we continue the model, it makes things much easier later on when you've got to go in and figure out how to piece together different parts of the surface. So like I was saying, in all the lessons leading up to this, you don't have to do everything at once. And for example, in order to finish off this vent, and I just want to show you in Photoshop, to create this line along here, at the moment we've got a bunch of topology kind of flowing down and it's all messy, and we've got this point leading off here. So how are we going to go in and do that? So I'll just explain that in the next part. What I like to do sometimes is I'll create a little point here and not worry about kind of what's going to happen to this, and then just go in and extrude the edges that we need. Sorry. Just select those 3 points from the side and make sure that they're the correct height. And now we've got this point here, but it's quite messy. So I'm going to pull that in, pull this in, and if I delete this point and weld this, once again, our topology is flowing really nicely and it's going to work in our favor. So from here, what I can do is I can drag these points out and weld this point up and kind of just unselect these areas and move it down. And then keep dragging out and just finish off this area. I'm just going to remove this point here too. So from above now, I just need to move these points in. We need to get these points flowing also, running along correctly here. Just going to take another quick look at the reference images. So now I'm going to select the entire side wheel arc and just move it out so that we're in the correct spot here. You can see we were just a little bit off. So I can go in and select those points, and I'm just trying to roughly move them into alignment. You can see there's a lot of geometry there and it's hard to tell what's going on, but we're just trying to keep it contained within the blueprint. We know that no part of the car can physically go outside of that, so if you move all these points in to be aligned with or close to this point, you're going to be pretty close. Just going to swap the view I'm viewing the car from. Just move this out. And you can see all I'm doing is just one by one pushing these points so that they're running along the side of the car a little bit more in a rounded fashion. So I chose this car for a reason. And the reason is because we have so many flowing curves, it's really quite hard to gauge exactly how round different parts of the mesh are. And you do need to go in and do a lot of eyeballing like this, and there's no real way around it. You know, it's kind of I can show you for 100 hours how to model a certain part of a car, and there'd be no real way to explain it other than to just one by one go in and position points. So even though there are some workflows that really help speed things up, overall there is going to be a lot of times where you just need to go in and do this brute work. And a lot of the reason why the images in my folio are so refined is because I've just sat there for quite a long time going in one by one and moving points. And it can be a little bit boring, but at the end of the day, it's, in my opinion, quite rewarding. You can see here, from the top view, these points that are lined up don't line up at all to the side view, which can get a little bit frustrating. So that's why I've gone in, and what I'll do next is I'll select these 2 points, and I'm just going to start over and just flatten these so that they're aligned again. Because this point of the car up here is hitting a pinch, what I've realized is that I can't kind of go in. What I've got to do is drag these points up closer to that pinch. So you can see I'm just dragging them up and starting to create that pinch. Just adding one more edge loop exactly where that pinch is taking place. I'm just got to go in, zoom in, make sure that when you ever connect edges like that you constantly clean them. So I just go to the target world and just quickly 1, 2, and clean it up. At the back here, it looks like I've got my points too low. So I'm just going to quickly raise those. Now to make my life easier, I've just decided that it's probably going to be best to fill this area in. And we can worry about cutting in detail into this area later. So we've run into a little bit of an issue here where from the top I can't exactly see where all these points line up. So we're just going to have to do our best and line it up as good as we can using the photo reference that we've already acquired, because sometimes a blueprint just won't be enough. So we've got quite a few points converging here, and I just want to reduce the amount. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select this loop along here, unselect the edge, the end point, sorry, the end edge, control remove, and then target weld back down. This keeps all the work we did on this edge ring flowing nicely, but we've removed an edge point here just to reduce the amount of work I have to do cleaning this area up. Going to remove this loop down the bottom here, and just align these here. So you might have seen me do it before, but rather than selecting these two edges and bridging, sometimes what I like to do is I'll select the border, cap it, drag over, and hit G. So there's multiple ways you can sometimes close little borders like that, and when you do it quickly, depending on kind of what you're used to, one way or the other will be quicker. So sometimes it's just, you're just in a rhythm and you just want to do that, or you just want to cap, select the two and G, and then move on. Actually, so here's another little thing, and it just comes down to how clean you want the mesh to be. If I was doing a personal work, what I'd probably do in this situation is just grab these edges, drag them down, and do a little bit of a scale on them. But you can see for a car, it's not exactly that clean. So to do the clean method of creating a support loop here, it's probably better to just cut it and then target weld this point to here so that we keep things flowing. So as I stop talking and just start to focus on how to clean up this mesh, the kind of fluidity of all the cuts and things becomes a little bit more apparent, and you can see how I'm starting to try and get back all the cleanliness of this polygon distribution while at the same time having all the proportions correct. So you can see I'm going from the kind of angles where I can get these loops flowing nicely, and I will have to go in later and do further work to get those lined up. But once again, because we've added in all this extra detail, I'm just trying to go in and make sure that all the edge loops are moving in the cleanest way possible. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you on this part of the car, it's obviously very flat. It doesn't go kind of in and then cut in. It's just a nice rounded surface, and when it hits that point, it just starts coming in. Whereas because I've got this edge loop that's so close, it's making my life much harder. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select these points. Sorry, I'm just losing my voice again. I'm just going to use edge constraint to slide those a bit closer. Then I'm going to select these points and move these a bit closer. So I'm just trying to space things evenly here. You can see it's quite a boring process, but it is necessary, and you do need to go in, and every time you block out a different part of the car, just work your way through one by one, kind of cleaning up all these points. And this is probably the biggest difference I've seen in having a model that's perfectly clean and perfectly, how can I say it? It's got perfect proportions, but all sorts of bumps and pinches over it. So I'm just trying to figure out if having this loop running down here affects the way I'm going to model the surface. So I'm just going to cut that edge loop in because it is important, and merge these two up here. And I kind of need to consider how I want my topology to flow. And I think what I'll do is I'll connect it here, get rid of this vertice, select this vertice, connect it down, and then remove this point. But that may need to change. So at this point, I'm just trying to figure out the cleanest way to connect this little indent in the surface, because this is probably one of the more complex areas of the car where we've got a rounded surface, another rounded surface going this way, another rounded edge loop going this way, all kind of meeting up at one point on the surface. So you just need to have a look at that, kind of play with a couple of options, and make some decisions about how you're going to connect that off. And sometimes the easiest way to make those decisions is to just block out a kind of rough idea of how indented the area is and create the support loops to create the hardness here, and then go in and clean that up. So that's just what I'm doing now. Going to connect this point up here, unselect this edge loop up until this point, just so I can pull that out a little. Now I'm going to do the same and connect on the inside of this loop. You can see we are starting to cut that area into the car. So you can see now, because of the way I work, constantly swapping between show and result mode, I can use the absolute bare minimum of polygons to create some quite complex shapes without risking having a really messy surface. And if you do it correct, it's actually ends up making things so much easier because there's just so many, it's just such a rounded, complex area. And if we have an extra 2 or 3 edge loops, it's just going to make life a living hell when we've got to go in and accurately get those kind of curves flowing. And it becomes near impossible, actually. And I've seen it so many times where guys jump in with too much geometry and have been lazy and just haven't bothered to clean those unneeded edge loops up. And the end result is that you think you've modeled the car correctly, but then when you see the reflections on the car, they're all wobbling and all over the shop. Just going to take another look at the car. Every so often, I'll just kind of reevaluate what's happening. You can see there's an edge loop flowing here that I haven't got correct. So from this point, I'm just going to continue it out and clean those points up whenever I do that. And all I'm trying to do at the moment is gauge exactly how I'm going to cut this indent in, because it is quite a complex area. So before I go in and just start randomly cutting things, I'm just looking at it from a few different angles, trying to gauge kind of how messy different parts are, as well as figuring out the best way to go about cutting in that vent. So probably the best thing to do at this point is just weld up and create this nice kind of hard right angle point, because I'm trying to figure out how to add all this venting, and I haven't even gone in yet and added in this kind of area here. So this is the next area I'm going to tackle. And you can see I'll basically just try and keep the geometry flowing along. It'll flow down, and that'll just keep flowing out. So to make my life easier, because I've gone in and added all these edge loops to support this kind of indented part of the mesh, I don't actually need those after this corner point. So what I can do is I can just get rid of them and not even worry about it for now, and just make my life easier so that when I go in and create all these connecting points, they're all aligned without having to manually connect all sorts of little details. See, I'm just making enough geometry to connect. As usual, I'm just blocking out the main edge loop. And then worrying about the other remaining details later. I'm just going to drag out these points back here and just start to block out the back of the car. And depending on what's making the most sense to you at the time of modeling, it can be a good idea to just jump back and forth between parts and just work your way through it. If you focus too much on one area, you sometimes lose sight of the bigger picture and forget how the topology needs to flow into other parts of the mesh. So that's why I'm just quickly going to go in here, and I've changed my perspective to view things from the back of the car, and I'm just going to kind of work those parts in. Sorry I'm not talking as much, I'm just trying to prevent my voice from fully losing. But I'm also trying to just let you see kind of how I work through different kind of complex tasks. Because in the next lesson, some of the things that I'm doing here, I'm going to show you on some more simple meshes. This is quite a complex mesh at this point, and I've gotten to the point on the car where we go in and start to detail these areas. It can be really complex and difficult to explain exactly the theory behind these things. So the best way I've decided to go about this is to show you in kind of real time how I'm doing it, and then to focus in next lesson on some more simple objects that take into account some of the workflows that I'm applying to this mesh. So now I'm just going to drag out this point here and just start to create that exhaust vent. If in doubt and you can't see through a certain point, you can either go Alt X, or I'm just so used to hitting F3 just to go wireframe mode, so when I'm dragging this point out, I can kind of see where it is in 3D space. Now this is quite a little complex area, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tidy it up. And what you'll notice is when you've got 2 points that you can't bridge because they're aligned kind of like a triangle, you'll see when I've gone to bridge that I actually can't. What you do is you shift drag up and then just weld the points. And then you've created that kind of loop. Just going to pull this in a little bit and connect these 2 points. Connect this point. And this point doesn't actually start to smooth out here. It smooths out a little bit more near the end point. So I'm going to connect these 2 up, select this edge, delete it, then select a border and cap that. And what I'm going to do to create the hardness on this point, I can just kind of select this edge, and without worrying about where this point ends up, I'm just going to go in and cut another point right next to it. So that support loop there is running along. And now we've created the hardness kind of seen in the real car. But it also needs to smooth out near the back here. So I'm just going to kind of pull these edges just a little bit further apart. And I'm just trying to consider at the moment what I want to do on this point, and I think because it needs to be hard, I'm just going to flow it around like this. And worry about this 5-sided point later. I could even maybe connect this point here. And at some point when I go in and add another edge loop here to harden this area off, I can clean that up. Or it's a little bit tricky. You can experiment. That's not exactly going to do it. We can't add a point along here. So sometimes it's best just to leave those. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to create the support loop around here. For this corner, we're going to need another edge loop extruded here. I'm going to connect a point there, weld that, remove the middle point, and now it's flowing around again. And I can continue that cut all the way along the edge here. Just going to drag that back. And this point I'll connect a little bit further down. I'm going to weld these 2 points together. So I'm not worrying about the topology further in here. All I'm worrying about is making sure that this edge loop, when I select it, rings around properly and accurately. So like I was saying, I've figured out how to fix that now. I can just target weld these points together and then remove this one. And there you go, I've gotten it back. I'm just going to go in and add one more edge loop to this area. I'm just going to continue this edge loop along here. I'm going to target weld that. I keep the polygon distribution flowing again. So to finish off the lesson, I'm just going to run through the last little bit of cleaning up this area that we've cut in, which is the most complex area of the car so far, and just kind of run through some of the last little things to notice. So what I can do here is I can cut down and I can connect this piece up here and then get rid of this excess geometry. Then when I get rid of this piece, I've cleaned up that whole area in terms of topology flow. And occasionally, after doing all the topology cleanup, just like to go in and double check once again and make sure that things are lining up to the blueprints. And now that I've moved this point up to be a little bit more accurate, I can just connect here and worry about the polygon distribution after I've added in the cut to this surface. can see going back to the philosophy at the start where once I've moved a point left or right, I try and keep it there, and instead of moving it left or right here, once again, just go up and down. Just kind of reiterating what I was talking about earlier in the first couple of blueprint lessons. This is where I'm just zooming in at a really fine level and just making sure that all the edge loops are kind of roughly the same height apart on the vertical here. So you can see zooming in at that kind of, just going to turn off symmetry here. Zooming at this level, sometimes you need to go into turbo smooth and just add a third one. And what I'm doing is here is, because our polygon distribution isn't flat, it just goes kind of horizontal and then in, it's creating too much of a pinch. So what I need to do is I need to pull that down and possibly even add a support loop underneath, so that when this smooths off, what I can do is I can pull it out and gain back a little bit of that rounded shape instead of that sharp 90-degree angle. So sometimes you will need to go in and do that. And that triangle that we had before, you can see that just really nicely rounds that off. But I'd probably, just to clean it up a little bit more, go in and add an edge loop along here. Just to create, you can see the difference of it rolling off, and then adding it gives you that bit of detail. So now we've got a whole bunch of points that aren't really being terminated here. So for some of these, what I can try is I can merge these 2 points and then get rid of that last one. And what that's done is it's created a square polygon, a four-sided polygon that's flowing really nicely. But when you do that, probably a good idea is just to drag this point back a bit so you bring in a little bit more square shape to the polygon. It's just going to smooth out your geometry that little bit more and give you that little bit of extra detail that you wouldn't have had you kept it perfectly flat. So now I'm just moving in and moving these points until I get it where I want. Same thing's going to apply for this point now. I can just merge these. It's created a nice clean point. So as I'm modeling, just slowly, one by one, all these points start to even out, start to become a bit cleaner, and you can start to see the intentions of modeling this low res. And if you do just put in that work, just kind of one by one, cleaning up these points, you will end up with a nice clean mesh. So I can push this in, cap this off. And I can sit here trying to clean up these points kind of one by one all day. But the power of correctly blocking all this stuff out has meant that in that last little bit of time, in that last kind of 10 minutes, you start to get a really nice low res clean topology, and it's so easy to adjust later on. There's obviously a ton more work that's needed on this car, but I've applied the same theory and principle to all parts, and you can see in just a matter of time, say if I put 2 or 3 days of work at my current speed where I'm trying to go slow enough where you can see what I'm doing, you'd have most of the car blocked out. And if you really wanted to cane at it and go as fast as you could probably bash it out in a couple of days. Because I'm limited for time in the tutorial creation process, I've kind of got to pick and choose areas that I think best show off different techniques and methods for cleaning up parts. And in this lesson, I've tried to cover one of the most complex areas and show you how, even with really low topology, if you do things right, you can end up with a really nice clean result. So this will be the last lesson where we're working on this car. Mostly because I wasn't really happy with how the blueprints were working out, but also because there's quite a few hours of content now and I thought it'd be time to get a free lesson out next. So in that lesson, to describe kind of what's going to be happening is you'll see different areas of the car that have different types of topology and that flow into each other differently. I'm going to try and tackle those areas in more simplified objects just so that you kind of have it ingrained into you how to solve problems like this. And when it does come to having to do these types of cleaned topology areas in more complex areas, you've gotten so used to the process behind them that it happens naturally. To a beginner, creating topology like that is quite advanced, but it's not exactly complex. It's just, as I found with anything I found with the boxing, you go through a learning curve where you make things out to be much more complex in your head, and as you begin to master things and figure things out, you simplify everything you do. It doesn't become more complicated, it becomes more advanced, but you try and keep things as simple as possible. So I've always taken kind of great pride in my models, knowing that they're as low res as physically possible, so that when I do pass them on to other guys in the production line, they know that they're going to be rendering something that's as easy as possible to work with when it comes to UVing it, texturing it, or rendering it. So as usual, I hope you really like this lesson and where the course is going. We are going to change things up a little bit as I go on, and I'm not sure exactly yet what the next project will be, but I've had quite a few guys asking me now to share a kind of course curriculum and yearly outline. But the honest answer to that is I think we're a little bit too early. There's going to be so much content that I can't really predict exactly what's going to be in each lesson yet. And there will be at least 20 lessons. And as these lessons progress, they'll probably become longer and longer, because during the modeling process, I can't show you how to do everything in, a 10 to 20 hour course like V-Ray. It's going to require a lot of kind of boring sitting and watching different areas that I'm cleaning, or that I'm designing, or that I'm kind of developing in real time. And if I don't do that in real time and just take off little snippets of projects like I'm doing here, you don't get the full benefit of the course. So the next lesson will be out next week, and that will be a free one. Thanks heaps, guys, and sorry I'm losing my voice a little bit. I just tried to save it a little bit there at the end of the lesson, and I'll catch you next time.